Good afternoon and welcome to today's episode of In Focus, the season finale of In Focus. Today we're going to be discussing a few different topics, from yesterday's announcement on the Transmountain pipeline to the National Inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. But first, we want you to join in on our conversation. Our phone lines are open. Call us toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. You can also tweet us at APTN InFocus. We'll be using a few different hashtags through the show, but we're going to begin with the hashtag pipeline. Before I introduce you to our guests, we'll set the scene. The federal government is pushing through with its plans to move the Kinder Morgan pipeline forward. Yesterday it announced what some call an unfortunate and unprecedented step. With more, here's Annette Francis.
The announcement to reporters came first thing this morning.
Canada will work with investors to transfer the project and related assets to a new owner or owners in a way that ensures that the project's construction and operation will proceed in a manner that protects the public interest.
The Minister of Finance says the message today is simple. When faced with a situation that puts Canada's international reputation on the line and jobs at risk, his government will take action.
To guarantee the summer construction season for the workers who are counting on it and to ensure the project is built to completion in a timely fashion, the federal government has reached an agreement with Kinder Morgan to purchase the existing Transmountain pipeline and the infrastructure related to the Transmountain expansion project.
Bill Morneau announced Canada will buy the Kinder Morgan pipeline for $4.5 billion and will allow the project to proceed under the new ownership of a Crown corporation.
Canada will work with investors to transfer the project and related assets to a new owner or owners in a way that ensures that the project's construction and operation will proceed in a manner that protects the public interest.
Green Party leader Elizabeth May says the federal government backed itself into a corner.
If the Federal Court of Appeal rules that Indigenous rights weren't respected, then the constitutional rights of Indigenous peoples completely trumps the federal government's claim that because we own it, it's now federal jurisdiction. It was federal jurisdiction without us owning it. But as of August, when the closing date arrives, Canada will be the owner of this infrastructure.
According to Conservative leader Andrew Scheer, it's going to cost taxpayers more in the long run.
We know the government is imposing new regulations in forms of a carbon tax. We don't know how that will be applied to this project. So that's why I say $4.5 billion. That's just the down payment on the total investment on the total spending that's going to be required on this, and it's coming out of taxpayers' money, and it was completely unnecessary.
Morneau says the ownership transfer will take place in August, and any existing profit-sharing agreements between Kinder Morgan and Indigenous groups will remain in effect. Annette Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Joining us now in studio, Cheryl Maloney, the president of the Eastern Door Indigenous Women's Association and a professor of political science. Niigaan Sinclair, a professor at the University of Manitoba and soon-to-be columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press. And Tim Fontaine, the host of APTN's Laughing Drum and the editor-in-Grand-Chief at the Walking Eagle News. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to cover a range of topics in this final show of the season for In Focus ahead of what is shaping up to be a very busy summer. We're going to start with the announcement on Tuesday that the federal government will move ahead with Kinder Morgan. And start, I guess, with you, Cheryl. Is this something that came as a shock to you at all, that the government, you, all of us here, will be purchasing a pipeline now?
I was not really shocked, but a little surprised that it came so soon. I know I was hoping they would have found some other avenues first. I think what I feel about it, or what I see coming up next, is a lot of criminalization of Canadians, and a lot of they're taking a really strong adversarial approach to democracy. They're using the taxpayers' dollars, and you're going to see a lot of the same things we've seen at Muskrat Falls with Elsa Buktuk, and also a lot of criminalization of normal Canadians, normal citizens, not just the Indigenous resistance, but the growing resistance across the country. And the other big shock is that economically, it's going to create a lot more in the enforcement side, the cleanup side, all those costs that are way bigger than the $4.5 billion.
Niigaan, your thoughts when you woke up yesterday morning to the news that you were the owner of a pipeline?
You could have almost predicted this, because going 2 years ago from when Trudeau says Indigenous peoples don't have a veto to all the processes that go up to, leading up to not just the past 2 years, but also this is a long-standing process involving really the last 0.1%. Indigenous peoples, we of course don't hold ownership, but hold in trust certain areas of territories, and those fundamental areas of territories are now under assault. That's what led to Idle No More, and of course now here we go with the Kinder Morgan pipeline. This is the steps of the last 0.1%. It really doesn't matter what government is in, Conservative or Liberal, when it comes to Indigenous claims over territories and our own bodies. When it came to the deaths of Colton Bushy and Tina Fontaine, we're not allowed to resist. We're supposed to acquiesce to all steps of control, and now here it is, I think, in the final stages. And what it's really demonstrating is a real split between Indigenous organizations and grassroots people.
Tim, your thoughts on the nationalizing of a pipeline?
Same as Cheryl and Niigaan. I mean, I wasn't necessarily surprised, but Canada has a history of doing this. They bought Hibernian, which is offshore oil. They've bought into the auto industry. So I wasn't really surprised, but you can see why so many Indigenous people and so many Canadians are frustrated by this move, because this is a government that goes around the world. This is a prime minister that goes around the world and says we're a climate change leader. We're this, we're that. We're so good to our Indigenous people, and then they do something like this, right? So I mean, it's really frustrating. It makes you wonder. It doesn't make you wonder. It makes you realize we've got an election coming up, and it shows you who is more important. The people of Alberta and BC were more important than Indigenous people from across the country, because that's who they're appealing to with this move, right? This was an attempt to salvage their image as being this really lefty, loosey-goosey government. And no, we're pro-oil, right? So will they get the votes because of this? I don't know. I mean, you saw Andrew Scheer there himself is frustrated by this as well. So I don't know who was appeased by this movement, by this motion, other than the oil industry, other than a handful of people, maybe not a handful of people, but a small segment of Canadian population was appeased by this move. So it's a frustrating thing to see.
Tim, Walking Eagle had a bit of a field day with the announcement yesterday, mostly comparing the cost of the purchase of this to water. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the PBO, Prime Minister's office, all of these different organizations, I mean, government themselves have said to fix water is going to cost, to fix the water situation on First Nations, which we all know is in a terrible state, to fix water would have been less than the purchase, just the first purchase of this pipeline. Now they're saying this pipeline is going to cost $4 billion, but when you factor in all of these different costs, we're talking about $12 billion. Between $7 and $12 billion. Think of all of the things that could have fixed in First Nations communities. And that's, they talk about it being, this is in the national interest. Well, why are Indigenous people not in the national interest? Why are we never in the national interest? So it was really frustrating to see that as well. And yeah, we made that comparison because it's ridiculous. It's like, we're always told, I know it's not happening fast enough. We're trying to find the money. We're trying to do this and that. But when it came to a pipeline, all of a sudden they dug around in the couch in Ottawa and they found $5 billion pretty quickly. So it shows that this isn't an issue of money. This is always an issue of political will. And they have the political will when it comes to something that benefits them, but rarely for Indigenous people.
Cheryl, Cindy Blackstock yesterday had a tweet of all these things that, this between $4 and $12 billion. Some of this money could have went towards anything on the top of your mind that might have helped out this country instead of purchasing a pipeline for that much.
Well, I do a lot of work with the justice system in Nova Scotia and or in actually Canada, and we're overly represented in the justice system. So there's issues around not what that money could do, but what the money's not going to do and what the pipeline will do. We'll see more of our people represented in the justice systems. I want to talk a little bit about the Anti-Terrorism Act, because now this is a national interest. This is the national economic well-being of Canadians. And we've seen the Army come out in Elsipogtog, and I'm predicting that those costs and the cost of Indigenous peoples being the ones on the front lines, particularly women, are going to be the ones that are going to be paying the price. So it's not just what the money could have been spent on, but the hidden cost it's going to have on our people, especially once we're all turned into criminals. The other thing that Niigaan mentioned was the divide between the grassroots and the organizations. When I was resisting the Alton gas, I had to step down as my position on council because the council was getting threatened to be sued. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the Aboriginal organizations, especially under the Indian Act, are not able to resist either. So it's going to once again fall on the grassroots people. And, that's the cost of this.
Niigaan, some of those grassroots yesterday were calling this move a declaration of war. What do you see unfolding here as construction potentially gets underway right away?
Yeah, I just want to add to the list. I mean, there's so many pressing needs that you could just say, where would this money should have gone? I'm thinking of the northern train to Churchill, and the incredible exorbitant prices that people in the north pay, not just for food, but for hydro in their own communities, for mines, for all the ecological disaster that's created. I mean, we could just add up all that all day. I think the real concerning issue here is this is a real divide and conquer issue. This is a real split. It's indicative of a huge split. We see national Métis leaders, national First Nations leaders who are all coming out in favor, and for the reasons that Cheryl's been talking about, in many situations have been backed into a corner because there's very little choice under the Indian Act. I mean, if someone comes to you and offers you millions of dollars and you're chronically underfunded with the Indian Act, and you've got moldy homes that perhaps that could deal with, I understand. But for the grassroots people, for people who are everyday living with this ecological disaster zone, when there's a spill, and with spills, it's never a matter of if, it's a matter of when. When these spills happen, it's grassroots people who deal with these situations on an everyday basis, and people who deal with not just hunting and fishing, but also our lodges and our clans. I mean, we need these things to maintain who we are fundamentally, and without an ecology, we fundamentally under attack. I can absolutely understand why it's been seen as a war.
Tim, you and I were both in Standing Rock at numerous times. Some of the embers from the fire that started there are in unceded territory on the West Coast right now. Do you see this turning into a similar type event?
I hope not. I mean, like Cheryl said, I mean, the scary thing is that this is, more so than Standing Rock, this is the national interest now, and she's right. This is the sort of thing where when you threaten that, you're threatening all of Canada, right? So, I mean, it's a terrible situation to put Indigenous people and Canadians in, that if they want to choose the environment, they're suddenly an enemy of the state, which is really what it is, right? You're putting everybody at risk. It's a really terrifying situation when you think about it. But it's also a terrible situation, like Niigaan said. I mean, here you have communities along the path of this pipeline, some of whom are, we all know some of these Indigenous people are for the pipeline, but it's because it's an opportunity, right? And they always hear this government say, oh, well, we shouldn't have to choose between the environment and money. We can do both at the same time. But that's not necessarily true. I mean, this is choosing a very risky opportunity. It's potentially a lucrative opportunity, but it's also a very, very risky opportunity. While everybody's arguing over this, the pipeline burst already. Yeah. You know what I mean? I mean, we saw it just the other day. So I mean, this is proof that, and I'm not necessarily anti-oil, but I am anti-environmental risk, and this is a very difficult position to put communities in. Whether you're opposed to it or whether you're for it. I mean, it's such a. Why can't we have other opportunities? Why can't we invest in other things and find other ways for communities? Let communities themselves find other ways of sustaining themselves instead of telling them, you know what, oil is the only way forward, because that's frustrating.
We do hear a lot about the opposition, but it's not universal. Cheryl, as somebody, you mentioned you were on council and had to step aside as an energy project was going on. Can you appreciate why some of these leaders, councils, communities would want to sign on to a project like this?
Well, that's easy. That's poverty. That's poverty. And my mother always said, she said, the best thing I taught you was how to be poor. And I think as Indigenous peoples, we need to start at that level to see where we are, what we have, be secure in that, and then start building up. The solution to this isn't necessarily a front line, and if it was a front line, I'd be on the front line. I have no problem with that. I think what we're going to see happening, and it's the complete opposite of what National Chief Perry Bellegarde tweeted out yesterday, or his response was, you need to bring us all together to have a conversation. And I said, no, you don't, and you shouldn't. You cannot bring all the nations in this country together into one room and make any progress. The progress has to come from the communities. They have to do that hard work of designing and developing their own nation-based processes where they can assess these things. Right now, they see money, and then they get memos from organizations that say this isn't going to hurt you. So I think, you know, it's ground zero to nation building, and I think what this is going to do, for what Trudeau's going to do with this announcement, it's going to have to motivate us to get serious about our nation-to-nation rights and that nation-to-nation relationship, instead of relying on organizations, regional or national, to be that nation. So I see some positives coming. I also see some not so positive things for national Aboriginal organizations, because the days of having national positions on things are soon over. And we've seen that with the National Inquiry. When political organizations try to have a national position, then you're going to get a lot of controversy, and that's what we're going to see here.
Niigaan?
I get many calls all the time from oil companies wanting to fund students. And these are students who many times are coming out of, often the first times coming to university, first time going to post-secondary, trying to get out of that world of poverty, and they are put down to a choice. They're put to a choice of, do I accept money from an organization that's directly coming from an oil company, or do I try to just slug by and maybe finish my degree or maybe not finish my degree because of these challenges? If students are facing it, you can just imagine what people face at the grassroots level. I mean, people are facing these in terms of you want your youth center, you want your healing center, you want everyday medicine. Even if you want to build lodges, oil companies are offering those opportunities. And the challenge that we are facing in our generation is one of life or death. And there's the quick choice, or there's the long-term choice. And increasingly, in a globalized world, we're being pushed to make the quick choices, but we're not thinking in terms of that 7 generations model that our lodges talk about, that our ceremonies talk about, that our songs talk about.
Tim, as somebody who used to be in the media and now a media critic, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the coverage of this all. I mean, when Kinder Morgan first put in that deadline, it seemed like it was a national frenzy, that something needed to be done here.
But the problem was, and APTN of course is exempted from this, but we didn't hear much from Indigenous people in the media, you know, and we still don't, even though they talk about what an important voice that is. It's not really taken seriously. It's like, oh yeah, and then there's Indigenous people saying this as well, right? But it's all of these non-Indigenous people talking about our land, talking about Indigenous land like it's theirs. That's the crazy thing about this. So you see these big high-level talks. You see provinces and the feds all arguing over what to do on land that is Indigenous people's land. It's frustrating, but that you don't see that in the media. You see, again, still always the protesters. You know, it's just the protests. It's just these noisy guys drumming there, and they don't fully explain why they have a claim over that land. They don't fully explain what the reasons are for them wanting to have a voice in that discussion, wanting to have a seat at that table, because that's just how it is, right? So that's how I've seen this framed, right? Is that again, non-Indigenous voices are more important than Indigenous voices especially when it comes to natural resources.
We're going to have to take a break soon, but I just wanted to go around quick. Cheryl, do you think that this pipeline, despite its opposition in the courts and on the ground, gets built?
I say, I don't want to say, I honestly don't think that Canadians will eventually stop wanting to put their money behind it, and I don't think Trudeau's got enough from the Treasury Board yet. The big price tag isn't even uncovered yet. I would say Canadians will eventually stop them.
Niigaan?
I believe in the people who yesterday tweeted this is never going to happen. I believe in the power of Indigenous peoples, grassroots people to spread that message. And I think Canada will be embarrassed both on the global stage. But all of that stuff, I'm actually, while will be terrible, I'm actually asking everyday Canadians. When I was out yesterday speaking with different groups, I said, how much money is going to be wasted now? Wasted not just on all of the time and effort that's going to go to hammer this through, but on police, on arrests, on the justice system, on building more prisons. Like, how much money is going to be wasted from all of this stuff that Cheryl's been talking about, the militarization of the state? How much money is going to be wasted in all of that to really get to us to a point where it's probably going to be stopped?
Tim, we saw the historic gathering in Standing Rock, people standing up around the world in that pipelines.
I would like to believe that, but history has shown me that that's not going to happen. This is going to be built. I think it was decided long before it was ever approved that this is going to be built, and that's how I see it. So I wish it was some other way, but that's the society that unfortunately we live in. So.
We do have one caller. Maybe we'll go to that quick before we head to break. And I understand we have Morris on the line from Fort McMurray. Morris, go ahead.
Hey, how are you doing?
Great. Yourself?
Not too bad. I got a question, I guess, for basically the leadership and the people that are protesting. There's two systems in place right now for the transportation of oil and gas or oil petroleum products. And, everybody talks about saving the planet. So the question is I myself, I'm all for dams and pipelines for the simple reason dams, we do lose maybe a few hundred square miles of land, but they use those to power the pipeline pump house that come into pipelines. Now, which one would you go for in regards to that system or the system of having trucks and trains on the road? Because the exhaust they're spewing out is basically contributing to the greenhouse gas effects. Now the question is which one would you consider more beneficial for the environment if you reduce the trucks and trains over the long term?
Yep, Morris.
Yep.
Appreciate the call.
Appreciate
the call and the question, and it's an argument that's often made. Trains or trucks versus pipeline, which is safer. And as one of our guests a couple of weeks back mentioned, not one politician has made a promise that there's going to be less train traffic or truck traffic out there. Unless anybody wanted to weigh in quick, we'll throw to a break. Anybody?
It's either a gun or a knife. I mean, why don't we just talk about let's stop the violence? Why don't we try that? Why don't we talking about different, more sustainable sources of energy? The idea that we're trying to talk about which weapon are we going to use to self-inflict harm I think that's an end game that's almost dead-endish.
Yep. I think we need to move and work and live within our environmental our environmental resources and start looking at green energy and the green economy that goes with it. That's not a conversation in this country, but it is a conversation in other countries that are very progressive. So, we need to have that conversation versus, truck versus rail conversations.
Tim, did you want to... Pretty much covers it, eh?
Pretty much covers it, yeah.
We will step aside now for a quick break and then turn our attention to some of the other issues as we look ahead to the big issues that are likely to make some news this summer, and we'll read some of your comments we received on social media. Welcome back to In Focus. We're going to go to some social media now and hear what some of you have been saying about one of our topics today. And here's a look at what you were saying online about the Transmountain pipeline. Instead of spending the money, build homes, clean water, health care, elderly people, veterans, and so much more you can do with that money. Never mind filling the rich pockets. and got the board to work. What a bunch of cons. They made a backroom deal and had no intention of listening to taxpayers, Indigenous leaders, or anyone else. They are criminals for this. Our next comment says, I'm horrified. Crossing Indigenous lands, increasing tanker traffic by nearly tenfold. Say goodbye to the beautiful waters off the coast. Janice says, the Canadian government does not work for people. It works for corporations, designated persons. Wake up. And finally, here a comment from Thomas. Trudeau assumes all costs and losses of the pipeline while he guarantees Kinder Morgan shareholders all the profits. Trumponomics in action here. Better scrap NAFTA while you still have our pants. If you'd like to add your opinion to our topics of conversation today, here's how. Join our conversation now. Send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Like our APTN InFocus Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus or call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. So we're going to turn our attention now to the ongoing national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Expert hearings are taking place in Calgary this week. Cheryl, you've been there all week, and from what I understand, we'll be heading back. Can you tell us a little bit about what's been taking place?
Well, I didn't attend Quebec, so this is my first view of the expert hearings. I was skeptical going in. I represent 4 Atlantic Province women's organizations, so we wanted to participate. But when I got there, and very, very disappointed in the narrow scope and mandate of the experts that the Indigenous commissioners chose. I was struggling to find relevance from the experts, and they had somebody there on the FILO, which is the Family Information Liaison Unit, which is a brand new initiative just the past year, and it ends this year. So the commissioners called these experts on this program to look at historical injustices and delivery of services, government services. And so it has zero relevance to the issues that leading up to missing and murdered Indigenous women. It's a small program that's meant to help families get through this process. The other, one of the other experts was a Yukon victim services within the public prosecution. It's a northern program. It's not applied nationally, so it's not even anything comparable to the southern or Atlantic region. And we struggled to find any relevance to them. The one thing that we did find out, the expert that was chosen is been funded for 30 years, has a strong, robust program, it's very successful. And then we look back to Nova Scotia, and we have 2 victim service workers in the province. We can't cover the whole province, and they struggle for funding every year. It's project-based. So there's the wide scope of, or the zero relevancy and the narrow scope had me pretty disappointed there. But we did make some progress in working with our counterparts in the Atlantic, where we were all sort of thinking we have to go home and do something on our own outside of the inquiry.
It is the 1-year anniversary today of the very first hearing that was held in Whitehorse. Tim Fontaine was a reporter for the National Network at the time. Tim, what were your thoughts? You know, what were you hearing from people in Whitehorse 1 year ago as this thing was just really getting underway and hearing its first testimony?
Well, it's not unlike now. I mean, there was a lot of, there was this real sense of almost, not dread, you know what I mean? But there was, nobody knew what to expect from the first hearing. There was so much anticipation. It was, it had been such a long time coming. And then it actually happened. And then we saw that there was this real incredible, I don't want to call it a divide, but there's 2 faces to this inquiry. There's the commission, which is holding it, which is by many accounts a mess, and people, that's the one that's making the worst possible headlines. People are frustrated by the scope. People are frustrated by its lack of teeth. People are frustrated by all of these things. That was certainly evident in Whitehorse. But then you had the families who were there, and for many of the families, that's why this is such a difficult situation, because for a lot of the families, the ones that I spoke to, and a lot of the families that I've seen and spoken to since, this is the first time they've had a chance to have somebody hear them. This is the first time they've had, or at least the first time where they've been in a position and in an environment that was supportive of them. Because it was quite an incredible thing to see when you have all of these families inside of this room and you have the commissioners there listening to them and all of these people around them. And it created this real situation where it felt safe for them to speak and to hopefully have Canadians hear that this is much bigger than the odd case here and there, right? The problem now, though, is that it seems to me that the Commission itself is not capable of taking those stories, of taking all of that information and letting Canadians know and letting government know that there's a lot that needs to happen, right? When you have police that are basically not able to, that aren't really a part of this in any meaningful way, when they are, to me, they've been let off the hook in this whole situation. And so that was evident even in those first couple of hearings. And that's something that I've heard throughout this entire year, throughout this whole process. There's these two things that are going on. I'm not saying all of the hearings were perfect, but you know, for families it was important, but politically and socially, I don't think as much. And that's unfortunate.
Niigaan, 1 year of testimony today, and we've only got potentially a few months left. Was the 2-year mandate a reasonable amount of time to begin with?
Well, if we reflect upon the past year, it's really been personified by disappointment, division, and desperation. And those three, if you add up those three things, from the division between the families and the inquiry to all the disappointment involving staff coming and going, and then now the desperate desire of the commissioners to keep going, to ask for longer time, it all adds up to a very dismal potential for any sort of resolution to come out of this. It's increasingly becoming evident that while the commissioners want to keep going, the communities, many families, many communities have abandoned participating, have seen organizations that should be at the table involving the police, the justice system, should be involved in the process and aren't. It's a very difficult situation, and obviously 2 years was not enough. But I wonder, as I've said before on this program, I don't think that another year would be helpful. I don't see this coming forth with many of the sort of calls to action that the country would get behind and then try to move ahead in a positive way. I really don't see much of an outcome coming out of this. And I don't want to be negative because I haven't participated the way Cheryl has, but for every person that I talk to that participates, they come away with those feelings, which leads me to a real trepidation going forward. I just don't have a lot of confidence in the way that the inquiry has positioned itself. At the same time, I also know many people that have worked for, continue to work for, and many of them are good people. Many are good people, but they seem to be in a structure that is almost unattainable for success.
Cheryl, you're at the expert hearings this week, but you also took part when it was out east. What are your thoughts reflecting back on a year of testimony as this thing is maybe coming to an end soon?
Well, in the East, the Atlantic women took over the inquiry, and the approach we took is we are hosting the inquiry, and this is how we're going to do it. We established the rules, the perimeters, and we made sure our families had a good experience. So I was part of that organizing team. So it was a good experience. I also gave testimony for a family that I had worked for, the Victoria Paul family. Her sisters, her father, they all died in the last 10 years, so I was one of the last voices left. And it was really rewarding, like Tim had said. We had 3 independent reviews done of this case, and at the end, to be able to go and take it to the inquiry and to give it another layer that just didn't exist in Canada for all these families, one more step with a little bit of hope. I felt like I did everything I can, pass it on, and pray that the inquiry can do something about it. That piece was positive. I think the government and the families have to feel that we can use that part of the truth finding for the inquiry. But I recommended to Minister Bennett that you shut it down this phase as a phase and come up with a well thought out plan phase that can compartmentalize policing, child welfare, some of those other pieces that need to be looked at that are not being looked at. One of them is child welfare, and they're not even having a panel or an expert on child welfare at the expert hearings, and it's causing a lot of concern. To the opinion that I think child welfare is too big a piece to be covered within the inquiry, and so instead of fighting to have it a part of the inquiry, I think that's one of those bigger pieces that Canada should pull out the policing and look at another approach to it. But certainly I think it's time to shut them down. But I don't think they will.
So you think they'll get an extension of some kind? There seems to be no word. Are you hearing anything this week on?
No, I'm not hearing any. But if the Trudeau government can spend billions on a pipeline and then refuse more time and money to the inquiry, then that's probably not a good political move.
I don't want to be too cynical, but it crossed my mind that soon after this pipeline announcement that there might be, you'll get an extension here now to the inquiry. Is that something that's come across your mind at all, Tim?
Yeah, I thought about that as a headline for Walking Eagle. Yeah, I mean, the cynic in me believes that, but I also believe that they had every intention of letting this play out. I think that that they're in an incredibly difficult situation. As much as this is seen as a failure or problematic, they can't really shut it down. I mean, I think they have no choice but to let it play out, because if they drop it, if they shut it down, I think that's going to be seen as a failure on their part, even though most people might see the whole thing as a failure. So I think the cynic in me believes, if anything, that they're just going to let this finish.
I'd like to switch gears before we do have to go to another break soon and talk about the pot, some cannabis. Recreational cannabis supposed to be decriminalized by July 1st. A standing committee on Aboriginal peoples was calling for a delay, citing a lack of consultation, but it doesn't appear that that will be happening, although maybe the July 1st might not either. But Niigaan, maybe we'll start with you and whether you think that marijuana can be a boon or a burden for First Nations.
Well, I'll talk about what's happening in my own community. So in my own community, there's a real movement towards a community referendum surrounding the issue, and our chief and council has responded to that, so we're under discussion as to what that's going to take place. I've seen a lot of positive discussion out of that involving economic use, but then on top of that, there's been a real abandonment, and I think generally in most of these issues, particularly around oil and around natural resource use, there is an abandonment to talking about the traditional sides of what this will impact, and the ways in which adding a substance to a community that is already facing issues around substance abuse, whether that's going to be a positive issue. And so that's really lacking in much of the discussion. And so because I think communities are doing it on a community by community basis, it's interesting that that's taking place, and it took that issue to get to us to that point, because it really doesn't happen at the community level talking around oil, but we are talking about the use of cannabis. And so I'm disappointed, but I also feel a great deal of interest in the way that the debate is going. I'm not a supporter of it, and I don't think that it's a good use of our very limited resources as a community. However, I'm interested in the debate.
Cheryl, I believe Nova Scotia already has a bit of a cannabis industry out there. Do you think this could help communities, pull some communities out of poverty, or compound some problems?
Well, my community was approached prior to Trudeau under the Harper government to start a cannabis and apply for a license, and they voted it down. I still wish they didn't, but we don't have a lot of communities, and I know there's some interest. But I don't know if we're going to be, we're small. I think some of the larger communities are going to be the ones that are going to get those opportunities. But they're fooling around with it, but I don't see it big. I don't see it big in the east.
Whereas here in Manitoba, we have one First Nation, Tim, that wants to be the Tim Hortons of pot. Do you think that there's a chance here that this could be an economic driver?
I think it has potential. I think, though, that we could have said the same thing about tobacco, and there's very few communities that are that are very prosperous because of tobacco. I think, like Niigaan, I think the debate around it is far more interesting, and how communities are handling it or not handling it, because this should be an issue like tobacco of communities saying, this is our decision. We're going to handle this. We're going to do this, and that's not it. It's still very much a discussion of, oh, how much is the government going to allow us to do, right? And that's frustrating to see, because whether it's this or anything else, I think it should be up to communities to decide how this is going to be utilized by our communities, right? I wish there were other opportunities for economic development other than these big boom things that happen, whether it's oil or pot now, right? Like, I mean, I just wish we had a diverse enough economy, and we do, to sustain our people. But I don't know how big this is going to be. I really don't.
I think the most interesting thing that's coming out of this at the moment is because the provinces have the say on natural resource use and on medicine and health and all the things that are impacted by cannabis, we are now forced to deal with the provinces. That is an interesting endgame that the federal government is always interested in us having, is us dealing more and more with the provinces when it comes to land and resource use. That is interesting most of all, because that is not the way the treaties were intended.
Unless it comes to nationalizing a pipeline.
Now it's in the national interest.
Okay, we've got to step aside for one more quick break, and when we come back, we'll be discussing the upcoming election for National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Stick around. Welcome back to In Focus. This July, late July, the Assembly of First Nations will gather on the West Coast, and vote will be held for National Chief. A number of candidates have expressed their intentions to run so far, including current National Chief Perry Bellegarde. Tim, you like to make light of the AFN a lot on the Laughing Drum and Walking Eagle News, but what are your thoughts on this upcoming vote, and is it something that people should be paying attention to?
Yeah, because again, there's this, and I'm not trying to play up that there's divisions in communities, because we're 630 some communities, we're hundreds of different individual nations. Of course, we're all going to have different interests. But there is something very interesting going on now because of the way the government is, and because especially what's happening in BC, right? So this is something that we really need to watch and see which way these chiefs are going. I think Perry is going to get back in, because I think that he's brought a lot of stability to an organization that has just come out of a decade of conservative rule and shrinking budgets, and now the money's flowing again. And that doesn't necessarily mean he's a great leader. It just means that things are a little okay for Chiefs right now, and I'm not sure they're going to want to upset that fruit cart. But that's just me.
Niigaan, should people be paying attention to this election? And maybe, there is going to be a lot going on in BC while this is taking place, including the potential construction of a pipeline. Well,
that I think is the story of this election. I mean, where it is. Really, the AFN Chiefs vote is always about who BC goes with, yes, because there's such a voting bloc. It's really the fact that the pipeline's being built in BC or being under dispute in BC involving grassroots people and chiefs. I'm more interested in what's going on around all the stories around the National Chief election. But I agree. I think Perry looks like unbeatable in this situation. But it's interesting, the other options. I mean, we have kind of an outsider with Russ Diabo is coming in, kind of a Pam Palmater kind of voice that's traditionally been very questioning or critical of the AFN, and now trying to run to see if they could change maybe systemic things in the organization. We've got Sheila North Wilson, who really took a stand on the issue involving murder, missing Indigenous women and girls, and has also been kind of a force coming out of Manitoba involving women. That's really important. And then Miles Richardson, and then some other voices that are we're hearing bubbles from, including former National Chief Ovid McCurdy and other people who are just talking, kind of putting their toes in the water. It's interesting, but I think in the end of the day, I'm more interested in the debates that are going to take place leading up to the election and then into the actual election itself.
Cheryl, I'm going to come to you in a second, but Tim, why do you think we're seeing some of these, last time it was Leon Jourdain, some of the people, that might have been lesser known, whereas this time we're seeing people that are looking to return after a long time out of that spotlight.
Well, I mean, if Ovid's coming back, that is extremely interesting, and I can't imagine why, right? Ovid McCurdy, who was a national chief before. I think it's an indication that there is some faith again in this organization, or at least and understanding that whether people believe in it or not, it is in a privileged position because it has government ear. That doesn't mean the government's listening, but at least they have their ear, and that means something. That means that when government is going to look for opinion from Indigenous peoples, they are unfortunately going to go to this organization. And I think people are hoping, like someone like Russ Diabo, who, like you said, has been something of a thorn in the side of AFN, for him to want to get in there, I think shows that he's hoping that he can leverage that in some sort of positive way, right? So, some years you have nobody wanting to run because nobody thinks it's worth it. Mm-hmm. But now we suddenly have people trying to get back into that seat. It is something. It is an interesting thing to watch.
Cheryl, do you feel the grassroots care about this election? Should they?
I don't know if it's so much the election that I'm concerned or care about. My interest in the Assembly of First Nations is the national voice that they're trying to put forth is often in conflict with other nations. And I know there's 65 independent nations now that say they are not part of the AFN, so we're looking at 10%. I see that growing. I see nations that, especially the Mi'kmaq, the AFN just passed a motion on fisheries, given the AFN the authority to speak on rights of Mi'kmaq rights holders. Now, Mi'kmaq rights holders we're strong. We know our issues. We do not allow anyone to speak on our rights, and we've taken it to the Supreme Court of Canada, and we've taken it to the wars on the water. AFN now is getting authority through their AFN mandates. That's not so bad if you think it's just an Indian Act chief working within the Indian Act. But the Prime Minister of Canada, through the MOU, the AFN resolutions are very easy to get, are giving a mandate to the AFN beyond the AFN role of Indian Act chiefs. So even my Indian Act chief and council, we left any body that could speak on our behalf, and we're doing our own. So the question of should we stay with the AFN, should we pull out of the AFN or any organization, is one that's very real. And we have other communities that are also concerned that the AFN can now speak on Mi'kmaq fishing rights. The government is going and molding the AFN that way. We've seen the 10 principles that the Trudeau government put forth, talks about evolving governance in federalism and how they're recognizing Indigenous governments as they evolve. And then they have the MOU, which is loaded with rights terminology that doesn't belong with Indian Act chiefs. So I see the beginning of the end. I know some people say it's relevant. I see the beginning of the end for national organizations. And it's a natural, it should be happening as nations build up. The more nations build up, the less relevant the AFN and any national organization should be. So I'm going towards less relevancy to the AFN.
Niigaan, prior to the last election, the one that elected Perry Bellegarde, you wrote about some of the criticisms that have been around for a long time with the AFN. Have you seen any of those criticisms be addressed over the past 4 years?
No. The AFN's, like most large organizations, very difficult to change. The criticism of the AFN, they're either too far from government or too close to government. That's really the way the pendulum swings. And I think that this particularly with Perry, has been moving much more closer to this government because this government sees AFN as a willing partner to be able to front many of the economic projects, the natural resource projects, oil, the pipeline. It's also getting a very willing partner. I think I might point out, traditionally, who has been the number one partner of the government? It's been the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. But now, interestingly enough, probably for the first time, I think, in history, you're seeing the Métis National Council and the AFN very much in concert with the federal government. That's interesting. I think that's interesting and worth talking about. But no fundamental structural change within the organization. But they have moved in terms of the one area that they have really worked on is the new language rights framework that the federal government is interested in. So it's not that they haven't been doing anything involving but just natural resources. There is kind of movement. There's always some kind of small carrot that the government throws our way when we're willing to come on the side for natural resource projects. But generally, the AFN is just, I think in many ways, reminding us of its usefulness and not usefulness. And I see, without any major structural change, moving towards, let's say, the RCAP model of looking at treaties as being the fundamental way we deal with the federal government. I just see the same old happening.
Tim, I'd like to give you and Cheryl another comment, but we're out of time. Tim, you and I will both be in Vancouver for the AFN and looking forward to that. And that does it for this last episode of the season for In Focus. I want to thank our guests for being here today, Niigaan Sinclair, Cheryl Maloney, and Tim Fontaine, and all of our guests that we've had over the past season. I'd like to also thank our producer, Charmaine Straker, and all of the people behind the scenes who helped put this show together. We'll be back in the fall, but if you have any ideas that you would like to see on the show, you can go to our Facebook page and let us know. Send us a message on our Twitter page as well at APTN InFocus. Thank you for joining us this season. Have a great summer.